So the last talk of the day, last but definitely not least, is Ruth Mullen. And this talk is, I positioned it intentionally after the previous two in some sense. It is a consideration of how social media is rewiring our need for God. And so the title is Unfriending God, How Social Media is Rewiring Our Need for God. And so Ruth is former director of Faith Tech Toronto and now a Faith Tech speaker. She is an instructional designer at Desire to Learn, a growing tech company in Waterloo, Canada. Ruth speaks on the unique intersection of the complex world of technology and working in tech with Christian theology and life. She tackles topics on digital addiction, social media, theology of work, the faith tech story, and much more. Ruth is also a history nerd and knows a lot of random facts about pockets, the pyramids, and the Vikings. So Ruth, thank you for holding out to the end of this session, and we're looking forward to your talk.
Thanks so much for having me. This was super interesting to listen in on, especially from an education side, and then also on the last couple of speakers on practically how we can use social media. And so today I'm going to switch gears a little bit and focus on what's actually happening and talk through some ways to assess our social media and how we're going to walk forward with it. So my first question for you is, when was the last time you felt anxious, stressed, or provoked after looking at your social media? And this is a standalone question, but I also loved what Elena said about Gen Z. In Cal Newport's book, Digital Minimalism, he started to look into people, or he started to notice a trend in people born between the years of 1995 and 2012, and there was increased levels of anxiety, depression, and suicide, which was exactly what Elena just showed us. But what he then noticed was the main difference between this generation, Gen Z, and like a millennial, which I am, was that this was the first generation to have been raised with an iPhone, social media, and constant access to the internet. And so they're predisposed to be anxious, maybe provoked, but they're definitely experiencing anxiety, depression, and wrestling with suicide. And then I started to think, okay, well, who are those people now? Where are they in society? In that age range, they're starting to graduate university, they're starting their careers. Some of them are getting married. Some of them are also having kids. And that's a lot of life change to be approaching with a base level of anxiety. And so we need to pay attention to that. Now, my next question is, have you ever noticed someone unable to make eye contact? Now, this could be a coworker, but have you ever noticed it in a child, a teenager, or a kid, a toddler? Early childhood educators started to notice that kids were showing up in daycare, so ages 1 to 4, daycare and kindergarten, and they weren't able to make eye contact. And so then psychologists started to look into it, and they went through, they started to dig in, and one of the factors of this was that the kids, infants while nursing, their moms were on their phones, and so they weren't having eye contact while nursing. Now, I don't think it's the only factor, and I don't think these moms were being bad moms, but what we took for granted was that kids learn how to make safe eye contact, they learn how to mirror emotion, and they learn how to engage with another human in that one-to-one intimate conversation time. And I know for sure I would have been that mom 100%, but we didn't realize that the moments that's spent in that intimate time is changing and developing an individual. So we have to pay attention to the effect that this is starting to have on the next generation. Now, the next question is, when was the last time this happened? And I'll be honest, I'm on vacation right now, so my family spent a lot of time around the campfire or at meals, and it's not uncommon for us to just pull out our iPhones. And this article, you might have seen it go around last summer. And when I first saw it, I was like, oh yeah. And then I was like, oh no, this is me. And I realized it's like I want community and I want connection. I just don't want it in person. And it's so convicting. Now, all of that I said so far was all pre-COVID. Since COVID in April, they did a study over 30 markets, and what they realized was that 61% of normal usage in social media use had increased by 61%, 50% increase in the messaging across Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp. in the countries most hit, and then 23% increase of daily users on Twitter compared to last year. So I understand this. I was living on my own during isolation, and this was my only contact to the outside world. But given what we just learned about what's happening in social media and our interaction with social media, we need to then pay attention, because our entire use of social media is increasing. We have to pay attention to this. Now, before I go any further, I want to talk about technology as a value set, because I used to think technology was neutral. I used to think if I use it for good, it was good, and if I use it for bad, then it was bad. But what I came to realize, and John Dyer was really helpful in this, but what I came to realize was that technology is a value set. So when I use that piece of technology, so if Google Maps, for example, I'm choosing to align myself with the value of Google Maps. So I'm choosing to not think critically about where I'm going when I use my Google Maps app. If I use Instagram, I'm choosing to have a creative portrayal of my expression, of who I am. I'm also choosing to put value on the likes and the DMs and who reads my stories. I'm choosing to put value in that. So it's not so much it's neutral, it's whatever I'm using, I then choose to use that value set. So the bigger question is that allowing us to rewire? Has that rewired us, or are we using it in a way that allows us to still be aligned to who God is and who God says we are, without it rewiring us? So that's what I want to get into and talk through some strategies really quickly. So the first thing you want to think about are your values. I think apart from technology altogether, this is a really good activity to do. I know there was a really great memorial for Dr. Bob Harp earlier today, and it's a little bit of a morbid question, but ultimately, how do you want to be described in your eulogy? What role do you want God to play in your eulogy? Because if we start thinking about that now, we can define our lives now instead of hoping that they say what we want them to say at the end. Because ultimately, they're not going to read out your LinkedIn profile or your resume or your grades. They're going to be reading out the characteristics of how you presented yourself and lived with other people. That's what they're going to be talking about. And those are your values. So the question is, what are your values that you want to live by? And what role do you want God to play in those values? Apart from technology altogether, just who do you want to be? Once we know those, then we start to look at, okay, how do we walk with technology? Now, the Bible is full of God's values, and there are many, many that we can talk about, but I'm going to just focus on one, which is dependence. And if we look at the story of King David in Samuel 24 and 1 Chronicles 21, the story happens twice, or he says the same, it's told twice. And so King David decided to take a consensus, and he said, okay, like things are going pretty well. I want to know what's happening. And so he wanted to know his resources and his army. And I get it. I love stats. I have a Fitbit. I like to track how I'm doing. If I'm improving, that's all really important. But God rebuked him, like severely rebuked him. And he gave him the option of 3 years of famine, 3 months of enemy invasion, or 3 days of severe plague. Like that's a serious rebuke. And actually in the end, 70,000 people died. Now, I don't think God rebuked him because he's anti-statistics. But what God was focused on was he knew that because of the census, it would increase David's pride and it would decrease David's dependence on God, which is super convicting. Because how many times do I, without even realizing it, pull up my Instagram and look at how many people viewed my story, look at how many people liked my comment, was it witty enough, how responded, and then I don't even think to go and have God time because I just felt validated by my Instagram. We're living, thankfully, New Testament, but we're living what King David wrestled with. Now, also, if we look at Jesus, he also showed us how he valued dependence. In John 5, it says, "Very truly I tell you, the Son can do nothing by himself. He can only do what he sees his Father doing, because whatever the Father does, the Son also does." So just really quickly, God values dependence. New Testament and Old Testament, this was very important to him. So I'm going to just focus on that one. There's loads of other ones you can look into, but today we're going to look at that one. So if God values dependence, then what? Well, the next thing we have to start doing is ask some questions. So we want to look at, okay, how is my behavior changing when I use these apps? So here, this is my fun spectrum that I pay attention to. But over time, how has my behavior reflected God and his values or reinforced independence from God? Where do I fall on the spectrum of that? If we were to look at my Instagram use, when it first started, my friends were all photographers and very creative. So I was very embarrassed of my ability to take a picture, and I didn't post out of shame and fear of how I would look when I did that. So not great. I'm becoming more independent and full of shame. Then I started posting, and I was really excited, and people would comment and people would like, but then I started to compare, okay, how many likes was I getting versus what someone else was getting? Although I know Instagram has adjusted some of those settings. How many likes I was getting, how many stories I would get. Is there ways I should change? Should I do a wittier caption? What was gathering people's attention more? And again, I was becoming more independent on God. And so this over time has meant that I'm actually less dependent on God and more focused on how are people valuing me through my Instagram. So I look at what's my behavior over time, and then I say, okay, well, what problem is it solving? Because most things are created to solve a problem, I'm still a little unsure of the problem TikTok solves. However, I've heard recently that, I know God values recreation and joy and laughter, and I'll just lump TikTok into that world. I don't understand it fully, but if we look at social media, I think that social media is solving a problem of community, especially when we're isolated in our homes. This allows us to have water cooler conversations with people. It allows us to know what's going on and be able to drop in for those casual conversations. That is an important problem that it's solving, especially now more than ever. My best friend is in New Zealand, and I've seen her 4 times total. But because of Instagram, I'm allowed to stay in contact with her and see what's going on and have those water cooler conversations. So I look at my behavior over time, the problem it's solving, and then I start to say, okay, well, is it worth it? Is there a way that I can actually use this and have it align to my values and God's values without it rewiring me to only be used the way it wants to be used? So that's where I'm going to spend a little bit of time. And then for those of us who are in tech, can I make it better? What can you do to actually take a problem and take Instagram, but I know Facebook's created a way that you can look at it without the news feed. So you can still get the community without seeing the running list of what you're looking at. So how can you make it better? And then the third thing you're going to want to do after we look at our values, we question how it's interacting with our values, and then we look at what are the boundaries to move forward in this. So if we're looking just at dependence, I want to challenge you and say, okay, well, what are you dwelling on? What is your news feed full of? Because that's what you're dwelling on. In Philippians 4, it says, whatever's true, whatever's honorable, whatever's right, pure, lovely, of good repute, excellent, worthy of praise, dwell on those things. Since we live by the Spirit in Galatians, it says, let us keep in step with the Spirit. Let us not become conceited, provoked, or envying each other. And I'll be the first to admit, there was one morning, I didn't even know I was really awake, and I was looking at my Instagram, and I yelled in anger in response to someone's story because I wanted to go on the trip that she was going on. And I woke myself up and realized I have a problem, and instantly unfollowed her. Now, maybe this is not new to you, but I needed someone to tell me this. It is possible that you can mute someone's story and unfollow someone without unfriending them. And so your communication opportunities are still there, but you are then filtering what's coming into your newsfeed so that you're monitoring what you're valuing and what you're dwelling on based off your newsfeed. Now, there are downsides to this because you could accidentally mute important voices that are different than yours, and you can create it just a unique voice to you. And I know in COVID, beginning of COVID, I muted voices that were just throwing fear around because I needed to monitor what was coming in. But as the Black Lives Matter movement increased, I went and made sure I had voices of color in my newsfeed because I didn't want it to be just people that sounded like me. I wanted to make sure that I had new voices that were challenging my thought. So what are you dwelling on? And is there ways that you can cater what your newsfeed is giving you so that you're focusing on God's values? And now some really practical strategies is turn on screen time and digital well-being give you a report each week on how you're doing it. It'll also shut down your whole computer. Mine shuts down at 9:30. It's a little alarming, but it helps me remember to go to bed and get off my computer. You can also turn your phone to black and white, which is very, very helpful and unengaging. And I actually regularly delete Instagram, so it's not on my phone because I need to manage and monitor my interaction with it. The biggest question, though, I challenge you with is ask God, what need am I meeting by using social media? I've asked this with Netflix. I've asked this with books that I read, TV stories that I've gotten addicted to. I go back to God and say, okay, why, what's drawing me in? And then I list out, I'm like, here are the characteristics that I love. Here's the storyline that I'm excited about. Now it's your turn. How do you help me? What do I need to develop to bring this in? Or what do you not like about this? Or I bring it into a conversation with God because he already knows what I'm watching or looking at on Instagram. Why don't I make it a conversation with him as I walk it through? So gave you a lot of information and a lot of quick steps, but ultimately it's a journey and it's not a one size fits all, and it's something I'm regularly monitoring. It's something that I need to make sure that my boundary is reflective of me and my relationship with God, and that someone else's boundary might be more strict or less strict, and that's okay. John the Baptist had very different boundaries than Paul the Apostle. John the Baptist only ate bugs and lived in the wilderness, and Paul lived with Gentiles and worked in the marketplace, and they both had effective ministries, but they had very different levels of like where the boundaries were, and I found that very freeing. So hopefully that's also freeing for you. So in all of this, God designed you to be most comfortable in his presence and dependent on him. And so the question really is your social media now rewiring you, or are you still wired to God and needing to be dependent on him? So that's really it for me. If there's any questions, these are some resources and ways you can get in touch with me, or through Faith Tech as well.
Thank you, Ruth. So I really, I think John mentioned that he was loving what you were sharing in our little chat, but I would completely agree. I think this is a really timely reminder, especially now when social media is being used so much more than it was before. So I had one question for you. Some of what you talked about was oriented towards when to set boundaries. One question I have is, how do you decide when you're ready to loosen those boundaries? And is there a way to do that in consideration of your relationship with God and where you're at? Like what kind of makes you feel comfortable with like, okay, now I'm ready to reinstall Instagram on my phone, etc.?
Yeah, good question. I reinstalled it to talk about this week. Like I reinstalled it yesterday because I hadn't promoted this talk yet. So that was one thing. Part of it is if I notice I'm not drawn to it anymore, or if I think I can do it without losing all my time on it. So I'm very conscious of that. And then when I download it again, it's on the last screen on my phone. It's hard to find. It doesn't have alerts with it. And when I'm really on my game, I have it on black and white so that it's not as exciting to read through or watch through. But yeah, it's something I monitor because I had it for most of July and then realized I got really lost in the explore page and was like, okay, I need to change this again. And so it's something I just regularly stay on top of. And I have friends that I have this conversation with. They've done it with me for different apps and challenged me and said, okay, I was complaining about an app and they said, well, let's talk about it. And I was not impressed, but it was helpful.
Thanks, Ruth. I see Angelo has a question. Angelo, do you want to go ahead and be the one to ask it?
Sure, I don't mind. My question is, I'll turn my camera on for you. My question is, what are some of the factors you use to make decisions on what are the desires you allow social media to meet within the boundaries that you set? So how do you boundary off different relationships on your social media when they're all in one app and one platform? Like friends, best friends, acquaintances, people you don't know, etc.
Yeah, good question. I think I go based off what they're posting. So if it was a best friend, I'd keep it. But if it's more of an acquaintance and what they're posting is not helping me, or I notice I'm getting more agitated whenever I'm viewing the content, then I'm much more mindful of that. I might mute their story and keep their posts, or vice versa. It really just kind of depends on my mental state. So it's a good question. I think it really depends on content. Because if that's content's making me more angry and provoked, one, also, then it's a prompt for me to say, okay, God, what do I need to go and talk to God? Why is this bothering me so much? My friend Adam Graeber at Device and Virtue said that some people use their Instagram to prompt conversation with God. So they'll pray through their Instagram for people, and also like they see someone just took a trip to Bali, which isn't happening anymore. But when it did, like, are you excited for them or are you jealous? And what do you need to talk to God about from that factor? So I think it's really monitoring, like, am I being provoked right now? Am I becoming more conceited and I'm becoming envious as a result of this? And then muting from there. Good question. That's a hard one.
Thanks, Ruth. So I won't read the exact comments, but there's a lot of people really expressing appreciation for what you shared and conviction around that too. So thank you for taking the time, and thank you for, being the last one today.